Okay, it's live and I'm going to pull up the slides.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Murray Ryman, and I'm Executive Director of WomenNC. We want to welcome all of you on Facebook Live to one in a series of our critical conversations. Today's discussion will revolve around gun violence against women. We have a panel here to talk about the different aspects of gun violence against women. So we welcome your presence. We're glad you're here, glad for you to learn about what our expert panelists will have to say about this topic. Before I introduce the panel, I just want to let you know that more information about our organization can be found, as you can see on the slide. Well, actually, it might not be on our slide, at our website, womennc.org. It's actually quite easy. So we welcome your input. We welcome for you to sign up for our newsletter there and to see all of the various programs that we do. Also, today is Friday, August 26th. And each year on August 26th, we celebrate Women's Equality Day. That's the day in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was put into force, allowing women the right to vote. And while there is much to celebrate about that day and the great strides that women have made since 1920, what this Lunch and Learn highlights is the work that still needs to be done. So while we celebrate the 19th Amendment, we celebrate Women's Equality Day, we're also a bit sobered by some of the obstacles that women still have to overcome. So with that, I think we will not have a discussion that is sort of a downer. There is much work to be done, but we have with us a panel that I think will give us some hope and some ways to effect change that make this hopefully an event that gives you energy and the ability to make change and to improve the lives of women with regard to gun violence. So let me stop that brief introduction, but continue with the introductory part of the conversation by introducing our panelists. First, we have Laura Cutilletta. Laura is an attorney, and she joined the Giffords Law Center in 2003. Currently, she's the managing director of the Giffords Law Center. Laura has previously worked as a staff attorney, senior staff attorney, managing attorney, and legal director of the organization. She's spent more than 15 years working with activists across the country and legislators at all levels of government, providing legal expertise and advice on legislative solutions to gun violence. In 2009, Laura established a program to track, analyze, and report on firearms legislation and trends in all 50 states, making the Giffords Law Center the primary resource on state gun laws for media, activists, lawmakers, and the public. Previously, Laura served as legal services manager at Stand Against Domestic Violence and staff attorney at the Legal Assistance Foundation of Metropolitan Chicago. Laura, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next panelist is Aarna Prashanth, and Aarna is a junior at Green Level High School in Cary, North Carolina. She is founder and executive director of Not My Generation North Carolina, and serves as the co-director of policy and advocacy on Not My Generation's national team. She's an activist, an advocate, and she also works on policy. Growing up in the Chicago area, she had experienced gun violence firsthand and has been rocked by the rash of suicides in her high school community. As a member of the next generation, Aarna is keenly aware of the relationship between gun violence and a host of other social justice and mental health issues. Now she leads My Generation North Carolina to provide a platform to youth and to break the stigma on mental health and gun violence. Aarna, welcome. Our next panelist is Samia Noor, and we at WomenNC know Samia well because she was part of the 2019-2020 Scholar Cohort, a program of WomenNC that you all can find out more about on our website. But she was a 2019-20 scholar. She's a graduate of Duke University, class of 2021, and she's currently a state and local government consultant at Guidehouse. Samia's research as a WomenNC scholar focused on reducing intimate partner gun violence in Durham, North Carolina. And she continued her research on intimate partner gun violence throughout the rest of her time at Duke, through her thesis and her research fellowships. So we're pleased to welcome back Samia and to hear the work that she's been doing and has done on this issue of intimate partner violence, and particularly in one community, Durham, North Carolina. Finally, we have Deirdre Keenan. And Deirdre is a national movement organizer at March for Our Lives, where she is responsible for mobilizing and growing the March for Our Lives movement and supporting youth action takers. She's currently a sophomore at UNC Chapel Hill, majoring in public policy and human organizational leadership and development. Previously, she served as press secretary, political director, and research chair for the March for Our Lives North Carolina State Board. She is passionate about mobilizing young people to advocate for their collective liberation through the power of movement building, and she aims to help reimagine community safety through her advocacy work. Welcome, Deirdre. Well, you can see that besides me, our panel is quite young. We have a current high school student, we have a current university student, we have a very recent graduate of Duke, and we also have with us an expert who's been working, Laura Cutilletta, who's been working in this field for 15 years. So we have youth and we have a more experienced person who can give us their ideas, their thoughts, and suggestions for how to improve the lives of women and girls with regard to gun violence. So with that, I think I will let each of the panelists have just a few minutes to tell about their story, about how they got involved in this work, what they're doing now, and let them introduce their view on the relationship of women and gun violence. So let me start with Aarna Prashanth. Go ahead, the floor is yours, Aarna.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you guys for having me here today. It's a pleasure to talk to you all. So before I get started and talk about Not My Generation and what we kind of do, I'll just quickly talk about gun violence as well as how it kind of relates to women. So gun violence is an extremely intersectional issue. It's extremely important to acknowledge that, just because there are multiple kinds and facets of gun violence. You look at mental health related gun violence, mass shootings, police brutality, homicides, and obviously domestic violence, which is what we're talking about today. And we see that gun violence is still so prevalent today, in today's society, because of the systemic injustices that have occurred and still occur today, especially among marginalized communities. And really, I think the biggest thing to acknowledge is that gun violence can really happen anywhere. And there are so many misconceptions today in regards to gun violence, especially with mass shootings and mental health and domestic violence. There are a multitude of misconceptions, but really, gun violence is a public health crisis. I mean, it takes the lives of around 41,000 people each year, and again, suicides account for majority of that. And even when you look at North Carolina, 2/3 of all deaths due to firearms were suicides. And then when we look at domestic violence and how that relates to gun violence, they are extremely, extremely tied together. And we see that 1 in every 3 women who report experiencing abuse from a partner in their lifetime, and especially when it comes to gun violence against women, every month around 70 women die due to intimate partner violence. And that's where guns and intimate partner violence affect all women, but especially the marginalized communities, including those that are people of color, as well as those from the LGBTQ community and those that are from disabled communities. And when you do look at other high income countries, it is evident that the gun violence epidemic is solely an American issue. And then I'll just quickly talk about what Not My Generation is doing and kind of does, and kind of how I got involved in that. So I got involved in Not My Generation a couple years ago. Again, I grew up in the Chicago area, so gun violence was a very predominant issue. So gun violence is really nothing new, but something that, I would hear about growing up. But I got involved back in middle school with Not My Generation, and since then, um, it's become very important to me that youth have a platform to serve their communities as well as to advocate for social justice, when it comes to mental health as well as gun violence. So that's kind of why I created Not My Generation North Carolina, to give that space and that platform to empower youth. But yeah, so Not My Generation, we focus as a national organization, we focus a lot more on educational resources and toolkits to support and mobilize localized coalitions. Um, so we've done various different kinds of toolkits. We've done a depolicing guide. We've done more of how to organize as a young adult activist. So various different guides, and a lot of our work focuses more on education and obviously policy reform, but a lot more on awareness and education. Just because that often these kinds of resources are not really often available and really public. So yeah, that's kind of what we do as a national organization. But in North Carolina, our work is more on the ground and localized. We do actively advocate, but again, we also do a lot more of educational work, because again, removing the stigma around mental health, and especially the fact that even well-funded communities, school communities, they don't have they don't have basic mental health resources for youth. And that's where it was kind of shocking to me, moving here about a year ago, that my school doesn't even offer a basic mental health resource. We don't talk about mental health. We don't talk about suicide. We don't talk about any of these things. We don't talk about gun violence. And that was really important to me that, we kind of address this issue. And that's kind of what our work is, again, focused on in our North Carolina coalition. So yeah.
Thanks very much. And I'll be asking you a lot more about these toolkits. So stay tuned if we have a moment. I'm very interested to know about the toolkits and how you are, sounds like, supplementing what a lot of our public schools are doing for students in especially middle and high school. Thanks a lot, Aarna. Let me move now to Samia, who is going to talk about her own research projects, her own advocacy on this issue. So Samia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to talk about my experiences with WomenNC and talk about my research relating to gun violence. So as Maria mentioned, I was a WomenNC scholar back in 2019 to 2020, which was my junior year at Duke University. I thought it might be helpful to talk a little about how I got exposed to researching gun violence. So prior to joining WomenNC, I interned as a law clerk at the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office, which is actually where I'm from. And this was actually really my first exposure to understanding gun violence policy and research. I worked with a lot of different units that dealt with gun violence on a daily basis. At the time, I was actually interning at the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. The city attorney was honing in on gun violence policy and doing a lot of white papers and conferences and joint panels with actually the New York City District Attorney's Office to kind of develop policy solutions for reducing gun violence within the city. And I'll never forget at one of the executive preparation conferences that we were doing to prepare for a press conference, one of the staff members was just like pulling out the stats. And one of the things he said was, women are 500% more likely to get shot by an abusive partner if they already have access to a gun. And I think that's, a statistic that really stuck with me. 500%, like, I don't know, it just like really appalled me. And when I got back to North Carolina after that summer, I applied for WomenNC that fall. And it just really seemed like a natural fit that I wanted to learn a little bit more about gun violence after getting that exposure through my summer internship. And I was relatively still new to North Carolina at that point. I'd only lived there for about 3 years. And I really wanted to understand, how gun violence, especially in relation to women, what were the policies in North Carolina? How were women being affected in North Carolina? I really wanted to localize my efforts and focus on the women who were around me and where I lived at the time. And of course, that was Durham. So when thinking about my research, I really wanted to have a people-centric approach. So that meant doing a lot of qualitative interviews and working with people directly to hear their stories and hear about how they've personally been affected, hear about policies and procedures. One of the main groups that I interviewed was the Durham County Sheriff's Office. And I think this was really helpful to gain some insight into the policies and procedures when it came to gun violence and domestic violence. I would say something that really shocked me at the time was when I was talking to the sheriff's office, and some of the individuals mentioned that if a police got a phone call about a domestic violence situation, and let's say, the victim was fearful that their partner could shoot them or their partner have access to a gun, there was really no policies or a set procedure in place that would allow the police officer to search or even ask the abuser about their gun. They could only really take it away if they see it, if it's used at the scene, or if there's some sort of probable cause or something like that. If the victim had just told the police officer about it, that wasn't enough to kind of like warrant that. In contrast, in California, a lot of different counties have implemented a procedure where if an abuser, if a victim mentions that their abuser has access to a gun or they're fearful, the police are actually allowed to, interview the abuser's family and friends to understand, if they think this is a real threat and gain probable cause to search for the gun. And I thought this was something that would be helpful in North Carolina, just because in Durham specifically, a lot of the guns that abusers or just people in general have access to are not registered. A lot of guns are purchased off of underground and things like that. So, they might not know an abuser has a registered gun because it's not on a record. So it's helpful to have the police have the ability to go in and search for it, or just ask family members about, have you seen this person with a gun? Do you know if they have access to a gun? Which is what was going on in California at the time. So a lot of my policy recommendations really centered on trainings and procedures for the Sheriff's Department in Durham. So for example, they didn't have a dedicated resource or unit for just domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and guns. So I think that was a very helpful experience just to get exposure to understanding the baseline policies and procedures relating to intimate partner gun violence in Durham. And after my fellowship with WomenNC ended, I wanted to do my senior thesis on the same topic. However, that was the summer when COVID started, and a lot of domestic violence agencies that I wanted to interview and work with were so burnt out with cases and capacity and strapped on resources just because of the pandemic and domestic violence rates increasing because women weren't able to leave their abusers in some cases. So they didn't have the capacity to serve as an interview subject. So I resorted to analyzing civil court protection orders and understanding the process of how women get protection against abusers instead, which is a little bit different than focusing on gun violence. But in general, I feel like I have had a lot of great experiences just learning about how gun violence has impacted women in North Carolina. And my current work is as a consultant at the state and local government level for a public sector agency. And while we don't focus specifically on domestic violence and gun violence, I've been learning a lot about how state and local government policies and procedures get drafted and learning how to kind of get involved in that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Samia. And I think you brought up something that I want to come back to you about. And I'm actually interested in our lawyer expert, perhaps at some point commenting on this, about preemptively kind of what you talked about that seems to happen either in Los Angeles or California that doesn't happen in North Carolina, which is not waiting till violence happens, but trying to proactively, if there's a concern or a worry, maybe get that gun out of the hands of a potential or past abuser. I think that's, to my mind, a really interesting idea. And whether Laura comments on that right now or later on, but to me, that's a really interesting idea. But let me stop talking and move on to Laura. Laura, tell us a little bit about your work and how it is that it is a useful tool for those of us interested in a more rational approach to guns. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. So I work with Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. We're a national nonprofit focused on preventing gun violence. We are led by the courageous former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. She was the Congresswoman from Arizona. She was shot in 2011 when she was doing a constituent event and fought for her life, basically, and survived, and has gone on to become a fierce advocate for gun violence prevention. And there's actually, if you want to learn more about Gabby, there's a documentary, a beautiful film that has just recently been made about her recovery and her journey. It's called Gabby Giffords Won't Back Down, and you can find that online. So one of the things we do in my organization is we look at all of the state laws and compare them and look at which laws are stronger and which are weaker. And then we compare that to the gun death rate in every state. And we find a strong correlation between states with weak gun laws and higher gun death rates, and the converse is also true. So North Carolina received a C- on our scorecard, in our most recent scorecard. And that's because North Carolina has a lot of gaps in its laws. So I'm going to focus on 3 of the gaps in North Carolina law that have particular relevance to women. Domestic violence laws, extreme risk protection order laws, which I think is what you were referring to, Maria. They're also known as red flag laws. And then community violence intervention. So I'm going to go through those 3 topics. And I also just wanted to mention that, we do a lot of comparison of states versus the average rate in America. And in North Carolina, from 2010 to 2019, women and girls were 17% more likely to be murdered with a gun. in North Carolina compared to the national average. So, this is a really stark example of why laws are so important. So let's start with domestic violence. Most states in the US and federal law prohibit people from accessing firearms after they've been convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence offense. North Carolina does not do this. So there's really no reason for this. It really makes no sense. Most states have done it. It seems kind of like a no-brainer. So that's, the first step. North Carolina should strengthen its laws to ensure that people who have been convicted of violent misdemeanors against a family member or an intimate partner are not legally eligible to acquire or possess a gun. The state should also enact legislation that requires courts to verify that people have actually relinquished their guns. So this is something that happens in a lot of states, not just North Carolina, but somebody can be prohibited by law and, they're told by the court that they are prohibited from possessing a gun or purchasing a gun, and then there's no follow-up. So there's no process to find out whether this person has actually relinquished their firearms. And as kind of a side note, state lawmakers in North Carolina should also consider joining the at least 10 other states that prohibit people that have been convicted of stalking offenses from accessing guns. So that is another area where North Carolina is lacking. And still in the area of domestic violence, protection orders. So most states have stronger laws than North Carolina when it comes to protection orders. So in most states, if you are subject to a domestic violence protection order, you may not possess a gun. In North Carolina, it's discretionary by the court, so the judge can decide. This should be just an automatic default prohibition if you're subject to a domestic violence restraining order. And this was actually a bill that was introduced in 2019 by a Republican state representative that would have required this, and the bill did not move forward. Okay, so I'll turn to red flag laws now. So we know that 2/3 of public mass violence is preceded by implicit or explicit threats. So there are warning signs in more than half of the situations. But unfortunately, law enforcement in most states cannot remove firearms from an individual who is at risk of committing violence unless they're already prohibited for some other reason. So 19 states and DC have enacted these red flag laws, which allow a family member or law enforcement to petition a court to ask for the removal of a firearm from a person who's experiencing a temporary crisis and is potentially a danger. These laws have found to be very effective. So studies have found, for example, in one state that for every 10 to 20 orders that were issued, one life was saved through an averted suicide. Research also suggests that these laws are effective in preventing mass shootings, and there's been a lot of studies showing that. So the last area, and sorry, I should mention that in 2021, a state representative introduced HB 525, which would have created an extreme risk protection order law or red flag law in North Carolina. It was also introduced in 2019. So there are legislators that are willing to push these bills, and we just need, the rest of the elected officials to be courageous enough to back them. The last area that I want to talk about is community violence. So community violence is a huge, part of the violence that's happening in our states. This is violence, usually homicides, that occurs in impacted communities. It is disproportionately impacting Black and Brown people. So in North Carolina, Black residents make up 22% of the state's population, but they represent over 71% of the state's gun homicides. 12 states have provided funding for something called community violence interruption. So this is when concerned individuals that are native to an impacted community are willing to accept a role as peacemaker. And what they do is they engage those that are at the highest risk of either being a victim of gun violence or perpetrating gun violence. and they interrupt the transmission of that violence. So this theory looks at gun violence as a communicable disease. So by interrupting that transmission, we can save lives. This is done in schools, hospitals, people that are incarcerated, in community. There's a lot of different ways to approach this problem, but it requires funding. So there has been a small amount of funding that has been appropriated in North Carolina, but it's very, very small, and a lot more is needed. So I think I will leave it there. Those are the three areas. I know I mentioned community violence mostly impacts, it does tend to impact men, Black men, more than any other population, or at least disproportionately so. But we all know, of course, this affects women as well. And, women have brothers and sons and husbands and boyfriends, and they are, being killed at a disproportionate and alarming rate from community violence. So I will wrap it up there.
Thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate that. Just to your last point, I read an article recently in the Washington Post about Black women whose loved ones who were male were, killed or affected in some way by gun violence. And the article suggested that there were women taking up arms in response to that, which has its own deleterious effects. But to your point, gun violence that affects men affects women, and vice versa for that matter. But I just think that was really interesting. The post highlighting the idea that gun violence against sons and husbands and lovers prompted even more gun ownership across the United States. Thanks, Laura. And last but certainly not least, let's hear from Deirdre Keenan and talk a little bit about your work and March for Our Lives and how you got involved yourself in working to end and prevent gun violence against women.
Yeah, of course. So I'd like to start off by thanking you all for putting this event together. I'm really grateful to be here. So as mentioned before, I'm currently a national movement organizer at March for Our Lives. So today I'll be talking a bit about our organization and the work that we've been doing, along with how gun violence specifically impacts women, especially through those intersecting forces such as domestic violence. So if you could go to the next slide, gun violence is the worst that it's ever been. And 2021 in particular was the deadliest year of gun violence in recent decades. It reached historic highs fueled by a surge in firearm sales during the pandemic, as well as increase in interpersonal violence across US cities. And at the same time, remarkably little has been done by those in power, and we won't accept it. Young people shattered voting records to get moral leaders in office, and we believe that they owe us. They need to do their jobs and protect our lives. So to tell you a little bit about our organization, March for Our Lives was born out of a tragic school shooting and is a courageous youth-led movement dedicated to promoting civic engagement, education, and direct action by youth to eliminate the gun violence epidemic. And we really aim to create safe and healthy communities and livelihoods where gun violence is obsolete. So if you could go to the next slide, please. The slide after that, please. Thank you. So gun violence is inextricably tied to intimate partner violence, as well as violence against women. And throughout the course of the pandemic, rates of domestic and intimate partner violence have been drastically increasing. Practicing social distancing and staying home is really great for reducing the spread of COVID-19, but for a lot of people, staying home isn't always the safest option because of domestic violence. So to put into perspective how gun violence really specifically impacts women, I have some statistics that I'd like to share with you all. So first off, people in a violent relationship are 500% more likely to die in a domestic violence situation when a gun is present. And I know that someone mentioned this earlier. So this is really especially scary right now because people have been stockpiling and hoarding guns in their homes in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, 53 women are shot and killed by a partner monthly, which is further evidence that intimate partner violence and guns are deeply linked.
And nearly 1 million women alive today have reported being shot or shot at by a partner. And this is exactly why the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is such an important piece of legislation because of its policy measures such as closing the boyfriend loophole and strengthening red flag laws. And 4.5 million women have reported being threatened with a gun by a partner, which basically further displays that intimate partner violence is a major part of America's gun violence crisis. And in addition, transgender people, especially trans women of color, are disproportionately affected by gun violence. Transgender women of color, and specifically, are nearly 4 times as likely to report that they were attacked with a gun. And this is exactly why our work here at March for Our Lives is really important to create a world where trans people feel safe and supported. So that's a huge part of our work as well. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So what have we been doing for the past 4 years? Next slide, please. Well, to start us off, we've made gun violence a national priority. We've advocated for over 150 state gun laws and helped pass countless across the country. And we also achieved the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, but that's still not enough. So next, we've helped engage young people in the political process. And we've really done this by making 2 million direct voter contacts in 2020 alone. So we're really making sure that we're engaging young people in the civic process, that they're getting out there and voting because youth voter turnout is so important. We also heal communities through the power of art. And here at March, we love to do art builds. We really believe that art is a format for healing and movement building. So that's also a really important aspect of our work. Next, we support our communities through mutual aid. In 2021, we hosted over 100 mutual aid drives as part of our flagship mutual aid program, Aid and Alliance. And finally, we've engaged in direct action to disrupt oppressive systems. We've organized and led countless protests and sit-ins, and we're still organizing. So what this really displays is that this time is different. 2022 is really about making people care deeply about eradicating gun violence. And so far, we've shown just that. We marched for our lives again, and we show that this time is different. We passed the first major gun bill in over 30 years, just weeks after we took to the streets en masse in June and held over 70 meetings on the Hill with legislators. So this year, our work is falling into 3 buckets of the 2022 midterms, judicial advocacy, and gun violence prevention advocacy. So if you go to the next slide, please. To start us off, we're going to be talking about the midterms. We've been working hard to motivate young people to vote, educate people on gun violence prevention, and engage political candidates on the issues. For me, a lot of my work has been centered around recruiting voter captains who are our super volunteers that participate in actions such as art builds, crowd canvassing, and pledge parties to really mobilize young people to the polls. We are also launching our first ever national back to school campaign this month, where we're really focused on pledging young people to get out and vote. We are also engaging in a lot of gun violence prevention advocacy. As you can see on the next slide, from lobbying for federal and state legislation to advocating for the divestment of SRO funding to go towards mental health counselors instead, gun violence prevention advocacy is a huge part of our work. And finally, we've engaged in judicial advocacy by protesting against the recent Supreme Court's extreme decisions in Bruin and Dobbs, and really fighting against court polarization. And while this has been difficult for us to organize around in the past, we're still learning new ways to get involved with judicial advocacy. So if you could go to the next slide, please, and I believe it's the one after that as well. So as I close up my presentation today, I just want to remind you all that our vision of what safe communities looks like shapes the change we fight for. Together, we can build a better future. And I will also be sharing some links to start a chapter as well as pledge to vote. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deirdre. And that really was rather uplifting to hear about the most recent victory that you've had And at least as you're telling the story with a smile on your face, that you've seen some good news on, on the fronts that you're working on. So thanks for that, because this can be a really distressing, topic with all of the stats that you noticed. I just want to point out one thing for our audience. We've learned about a bunch of stats. I have a few of my own. And the reason I found these statistics was because of all of you agreeing to be part of this roundtable. And not only are many of you, all of you are women identifying, but so many of you are young on this panel. And listen to these stats that I found. From 2019 to 2020, gun homicides among children and teenagers rose dramatically. As a result, firearms are now the leading cause of death for Americans ages 1 to 17. Gun homicides? Absolutely, for me, absolutely flabbergasting. The United States has a gun homicide rate among young people that is 49 times higher than that of other developed nations. Nearly 2/3 of shootings at K through 12 schools between 2013 and 2019 took place at schools where children of color made up the majority of students. We've heard today about the intersectionality of gun violence and how it disproportionately affects those people in marginalized community. But once again, children are often the recipients of this violence. Black youth are 14 times more likely than their white peers to be killed by a firearm. And Latinx youth are 3 times more than their white peers to be killed by a firearm. So this is something that affects not only, obviously, women, not only all Americans, but to me, it's no surprise that we have on this panel young people, because you and your colleagues and cohort are dying at unimaginable levels. So anyway, I thought I'd throw out some more stats because, like Samia, there are some that just really struck me. So let me ask a few questions that pop to mind. I mentioned that I wanted to hear more about Aarna's education kits. And I think that stems from her belief that there's not enough being done in the public school system to address some of the issues surrounding gun violence for youth particularly. Talk to us a little bit about those kits and who gets them, how they're delivered. What are you doing to help youth?
Yeah, so these toolkits were created by My Generation, and they focus on a multitude of different topics. So we did a depolicing advocacy guide, which focuses on again, like more intersectional issues, talking about housing, talking about healthcare, talking about various different aspects that do relate to gun violence and are more intersectional. And then we also have more of a youth advocacy guide, so kind of how to organize as a young adult, and kind of how to mobilize a community in the way that the community, more like customizable to the community and what the community really needs. So that's kind of what our major guides focus on. But really it's more for youth, just because in our public school system, there isn't enough being done about mental health or gun violence. It's not even talked about. There's quite literally no form of resources or education about any of these topics. And even when we look at gun violence today, and actually I asked a couple of youth at my school, kind of what they knew about gun violence, and a lot of their opinions played into the stigmas and the misconceptions that are still prevalent in today's society. And that's where really these kind of guides, they're really promoted through various organizations and through our partners, and sending them out to our localized coalitions But that's where these guides are extremely important and important to educate, as well as this is more of an outside of school thing, but obviously to educate our youth today.
So are those guides available on your website?
Yes, I can definitely send them as well.
Okay, say the name of the website and we might have that in a slide, but we'll certainly have it on our YouTube channel and we'll have this on our website. But say the name of your website so people might be able to access those guides.
Yeah, it's notmygenerationgvp.org.
Notmygenerationgvp.org. Laura, let me turn to you. I have a question. In some ways, this is a choir right here, to use an analogy. We are all deeply concerned about gun violence. And I think all of us are kind of shaking our heads when our colleagues talk about their work. There's more guns in the United States than there are people. And so there's a lot of people who are not part of this choir. There's a lot of legislators, to your point earlier, who have not passed laws. Talk to us, if you could, about what your organization is or is not doing to not further alienate those who are a little bit about this message we're talking about here, how to get to bring them along and to get more people concerned about this issue that all of us here today are.
Sure. So statistics show us, and polling shows us, that the majority of gun owners support the types of measures that we've all been talking about on this call. So most gun owners are reasonable, responsible. It's really the more extreme, parts of the gun lobby that are, vociferously opposing all of these different common sense measures. And our organization, as I mentioned, is founded by Gabby Giffords and actually her husband as well, Mark Kelly, who's a senator from Arizona. And they're both gun owners. They support gun ownership as we do as an organization. And so part of our idea for how to approach this problem is to use gun owners, is to use gun owners as a bridge in a way, because a lot of times, when you think about like training police, for example, a lot of times police want to be trained by other police officers, and judges are the same way, and doctors and lawyers. And so gun owners are similar. They want to hear from other gun owners. They don't want to hear necessarily from somebody who's never held a gun. So we do have thousands of gun owners who have signed up for our Gun Owners for Safety program. And these are people that, own guns, and they're enthusiastic about guns, and they're also enthusiastic about gun safety. And they testify for us. They educate other gun owners. They talk to the media. We brought them to DC, and they lobbied senators to vote for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that Deirdre was talking about. And so it's been a wonderful part, I think, of our approach to a solution to this problem.
Great, thank you for that. I'd also like to address something that regards mental health, and several of you have commented on mental health issues. And as I see it, and I am absolutely not an expert, but that never stops me from commenting on an issue. As I see it, there's a lot of perhaps misinformation about who people who commit violent acts with a gun are, and who they're not. And there's also, as I think it was, I think it was Aarna, but maybe it wasn't, talked about most gun homicides are suicides. And most people think of those who commit suicide as having mental health challenges. And there are those who believe that all mass shooters are, mental health involved. And really the answer to gun violence is more mental health. And I think a lot of us kind of look askance at that. But I wonder, and I don't really know who to ask this of, so I'll throw it out and hopefully start a little bit of a discussion. Talk a little bit about mental health, gun violence, suicide, mass shooters, any kind of misconceptions or conceptions of mental health and its relationship to gun violence that you think would be interesting for us to know about.
Well, I would love to jump in and then I'll turn it to someone else. But on the subject of suicide, the biggest determining factor of whether somebody who attempts suicide ends up dying is whether they used a gun or not. It's the means that they use. It's not whether they were depressed, whether, you know, they were drinking, or, you know, there's when you look at every other possible factor, it's whether there was a gun or not, because you know, most people who attempt suicide go and survive go on to live the rest of their life. They don't end up dying by suicide. And so that indicates that there is a temporary crisis that's happening. It might not have anything to do with mental health. Sometimes, you know, we're talking about teens who are impulsive and are in a moment of crisis, and they make a terrible decision. And if there's a gun accessible, unfortunately, most of, you know, vast majority of the time, 90-something% of the time, that suicide attempt will end up in a fatality.
Anybody else want to address the mental health and its relationship to gun violence, and some of what I've heard from what it appears to be the right, as opposed to the left, about saying we can solve this problem with a bit more money being funneled into to use, you know, Aarna's idea of, you know, needing to supplement what goes on with, you know, a nonprofit's toolkits. Is that the answer? Is mental health, and that's really a question, is mental health, and if we solve the mental health problem, we might solve the gun problem?
Yeah, I definitely like to jump in there. I'll just preface this by saying I personally haven't done a lot of like research on like the correlation between mental health and gun violence. So this is more of just my opinion, but I don't think it's necessarily helpful to frame that if we solve mental health, we'll solve gun violence, because not every single person who has mental health issues is going to be someone who ends up, you know, committing acts of violence with a gun. I think it's almost harmful to have that portrayal. And sometimes, you know, when we do have gun violence portrayed in the media, it is portrayed that way, and like, oh, this person was a shooter, this person did commit these acts of violence because they have, you know, depression, because they have bipolar disorder and things like that. And I will say, like, it's necessarily a contributing factor, but it's not the only reason why or how that person committed that act. I think, you know, a more important factor is, how did they get access to a gun? How, you know, could they have been trained in gun safety? You know, even in cases of like kids who like are accidentally, you know, got into their parents' guns, like, you know, how can we like prevent those instances? And I think, of course, if we do funnel more money towards mental health and intervention programs, I think it will help reduce gun violence, but it's not going to reduce every single case of gun violence. And it's certainly not by focusing only on mental health. I think it would only stigmatize people from getting help. Like, let's say some people, you know, are interested in getting help for mental health. If we continue to kind of correlate these two, you know, people might feel stigmatized. If I'm getting help for, you know, like, if someone's getting help for their depression, for their anxiety, does that mean that they're, you know, they're a potential shooter or like a potential person who's going to commit an act of violence? No. So I think, you know, we got to reduce this sort of stigmatization and link between mental health and gun violence, because it is an issue, but it's not the only reason why people are committing these acts of violence. And I think that's not accurately portrayed sometimes in a lot of the media coverage.
I definitely agree with everything you just said, Samia. Yes, mental health does play a big part in gun violence, but at the same time, it's important to, again, gun violence is so intersectional that you have to look at the historical aspect to it, and systemic injustices and systemic poverty. And it's not just mental health that plays a big role in gun violence that we see today. And like Laura said, lot of suicides, and based off of research, a lot of suicides, especially among youth, are more impulsive decisions. And that's where legislation, again, plays a huge role in that, when it comes to various different things, such as like waiting periods. And again, even talking about mental health is so is so essential, because that's how these stigmas become normalized. That's how these misconceptions become normalized. And that's where, if it isn't being talked about in schools, in public schools, and especially when when mental health and suicide rates among youths are just constantly on the rise, then there's really no way to reduce these stigmas and to really address how to really reduce gun violence.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think that the mental health crisis in this country is a huge public health emergency. And millions of Americans are struggling with, undiagnosed and untreated mental illnesses. They often lack the resources, the health care to receive treatment for their, issues. And so that I think that, when we're looking at people with mental illness, they're often, mischaracterized as being a threat to others. But when you look at, the numbers, they're actually more likely, both people with mental illness and people with disabilities are more likely to be a victim of gun violence themselves, rather than the ones committing it. So I think when you look at, these mass shooters, it's often that it's fueled by, hate, racism, misogyny. There's a lot of statistics that show that mass shooters will often kill a female family member or a partner prior to committing their mass shooting. So I think it's important to understand that we very much do need to invest in mental health, but also realize that I don't think that's the core issue, while at the same time it's again one of these many intersecting topics that impact and influence the gun violence epidemic in this country.
Thank you. I have a host of other questions, but let me just check in with our intern, Eileen Tan, to see if there are any pressing questions that she has noted on our Facebook page. Eileen, you're muted if you're trying to talk. All right, well, let me go. If she's got some, she'll interrupt me. Let me just note a few things here. I noted earlier the statistics that jumped out at me about how youth are so impacted. I also, because I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, I also want to remind our viewers who's on the call here. This is a conversation among women. And women throughout American history have often been a very, very progressive element. And it's no surprise to me that we see Laura on the call doing this work for 15 years. We have a high school student, a college student, and a recent grad also deeply involved in this work. They identify as women. And I want, which is not to say that all women are on the right side of history or all progressive, but it's just no surprise that this is the group that's gathered here today. This is the group that argued for the passage of the 19th Amendment. And this is women who argued for good labor laws in the earlier and middle part of the last century. And here we are once again, deeply entrenched in the issue of gun violence. So while it's not perfect, I feel really heartened, not just by the fact that there's young and slightly older people on this call, but that there's a real power in organizing together as women. So we have a few more minutes before our 1 o'clock cutoff. Oh, let's see. There is a question in the Zoom. I talked to a Durham high school senior last weekend, and she has already seen 5 guns in her school during week 1 of school. How can we get these guns out of schools? Ugh, that's scary.
I would just want to throw in that, most school shooters get their guns from their parents. They get their guns from the homes that they live in. So we need to make sure that parents understand that they need to keep their guns locked and not loaded, not accessible to children. There are lots of laws, that bills that can be brought in North Carolina. North Carolina already has some of these laws. And I'll just quickly mention a law that was just enacted in California that's kind of interesting. It requires superintendents of public schools to send a letter to every parent in the district, just basically giving them the facts about how dangerous it is to have an unlocked and loaded gun in the home and encouraging them to lock their guns.
All right, so that's one way to keep guns out of schools. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I'll just jump in real quick and say that I think, if you're a parent that does have a gun in the home, I think there is responsibility on your part to educate your children and anyone that's in your home about, kind of gun safety, about reasons why they have a gun, and then, why other people have a gun, and why I think the schools do have, responsibility on teaching kids about gun safety and mental health and things like that. I think, if you're the parent who has access to the gun and it's in your household, there's a responsibility on your part as well to educate your children about that and, why they shouldn't have access to it, why it's not legal for kids to own guns, things like that. I think as a parent, there is a responsibility there.
All right, we have 1 minute to go, and let me ask Ava if there are some slides to be put up with some links for further education, further access. As she does this, I do want to thank Ava Smith, who is head of growth and development for WomenNC, for all the work she puts into these lunch and learns, to our intern, our high school intern, Eileen Tan, who has been instrumental in getting us to think more deeply at WomenNC about this issue. And on the screen now, you see some resources for further education, further action. These will be on our website, womennc.org. This recording will be on our Facebook page if you want to refer anyone to it. And it will also, it will be on our Facebook page, and it'll be on our YouTube channel as well, WomenNC Official. So I don't like to keep anybody past 1 o'clock. So I will sincerely thank our panelists for joining us. I'm heartened. North Carolina did, according to Laura, get a C-. We have a lot of work to do, but we've got Deirdre and Aarna working in North Carolina with youth. We've got Samia, who's in New York, but I don't really know where she's working on these issues. And we have Laura working more globally on these issues. We in North Carolina, I think, can be heartened by Deirdre and Aarna, and thankful for Laura's work at the national, including state level analysis, and for Samia working with local and state governments on these and related issues. So with that, I will say goodbye to everyone and thank you. We'll be doing another lunch and learn in September on what North Carolinians can do now that Roe has been overturned, and we need to go at the state level to think about reproductive health care for women. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for joining. Thank you to our panelists, and happy Women's Equality Day. I hope this has left you not feeling too sad, but heartened that people care about this really, really important issue. Thank you all.